What if I told you that right now, miles beneath the surface of our oceans, there exists a world so alien and hostile that it makes the vacuum of space look like a cozy living room? A place where creatures don't just survive in conditions that would instantly kill you and me, but where they've evolved into something far more dangerous than anything we've ever encountered on land. And what if these microscopic killers, these deep-sea microbes that have been trapped in the abyss for millions of years, suddenly found a way to reach the surface? Today, we're going to explore a scenario that keeps marine biologists awake at night and has government agencies quietly preparing contingency plans they hope they'll never need to use. Because what lurks in the deepest trenches of our planet isn't just scientifically fascinating, it's potentially catastrophic. I'm going to take you on a journey into the most extreme environments on Earth, where pressure can crush submarines like tin cans and where life has evolved in ways that challenge everything we thought we knew about biology. We'll uncover why these deep-sea microbes are so uniquely deadly, how they could potentially reach the surface, and what would happen if they did. But more importantly, we'll examine the real scientific evidence behind this scenario and why some experts believe it's not a matter of if, but when. The ocean covers more than 70% of our planet's surface, yet we've explored less than 5% of it. That means there's an entire world down there, larger than all the continents combined, that remains virtually unknown to us. And in the deepest parts of this underwater realm, in trenches that plunge deeper than Mount Everest, is tall. Life has been quietly evolving for hundreds of millions of years. These aren't the friendly dolphins and colorful fish we see in documentaries. We're talking about organisms that exist in complete darkness, under crushing pressure that's over 1,000 times greater than what we experience at sea level. The temperature hovers just above freezing, and there's no oxygen to speak of. It's a world that seems designed to prevent life from existing at all. Yet life doesn't just exist down there. It thrives. The microbes we're talking about have evolved in isolation for so long that they've developed biochemical processes we're only beginning to understand. Some of them don't need oxygen to survive. Instead, they've learned to extract energy from chemicals that would be toxic to surface life. Others have developed the ability to produce compounds that are so potent, so alien to surface biology, that our immune systems wouldn't even recognize them as threats until it was too late. But here's where things get really interesting. These deep-sea environments aren't as isolated as we once thought. Ocean currents, underwater volcanic activity, and even human activities like deep-sea mining are creating pathways that could potentially bring these microbes closer to the surface than they've ever been before. In the past decade alone, we've discovered hydrothermal vents that create massive columns of superheated water, carrying whatever lives in the depths up toward the surface layers of the ocean. We've found underwater rivers and currents that can transport microscopic life across vast distances, and we've realized that the ocean's layers aren't as separate and distinct as we once believed. Climate change is making this even more complex. As ocean temperatures rise and currents shift, the barriers that have kept deep-sea life in the depths for millions of years are becoming more permeable. What was once trapped in the abyss now has new opportunities to migrate upward. Now, you might be thinking that even if these microbes did reach the surface, they'd simply die from the change in pressure and environment. After all, they're adapted to extreme conditions, right? Well, that's where this scenario becomes truly terrifying, because some of these deep-sea microbes aren't just adapted to extreme conditions. They're what scientists call extremophiles, organisms that don't just survive in hostile environments, but actually require them to thrive. But here's the twist that makes them so dangerous. Many of these microbes have what's called metabolic flexibility. They can switch between different ways of surviving depending on their environment. It's like having a car that can run on gasoline, diesel, electricity, or even water, depending on what's available. This adaptability is what allowed them to survive in the depths for so long. But it's also what could make them incredibly dangerous if they reached the surface. Recent research has shown that some deep-sea microbes can remain dormant for incredibly long periods, essentially going into a kind of biological suspended animation until conditions are right for them to become active again. We've found microbes in deep-sea sediments that have been dormant for millions of years, yet when exposed to the right conditions in laboratory settings, they spring back to life as if no time had passed at all. This means that even if these microbes were transported to surface waters and initially appeared to die off, they could potentially remain dormant in the water column or in marine sediments, waiting for the right trigger to reactivate, and we have no idea what those triggers might be. The biochemistry of these deep-sea microbes is unlike anything we see in surface life. They've evolved to use chemical processes that are so different from what we're familiar with that they're essentially alien forms of life, sharing our planet. Some produce toxins as a byproduct of their normal metabolism that are thousands of times more potent than anything produced by surface organisms. Others have developed the ability to break down and metabolize compounds that surface life depends on for survival. Imagine a microbe that could literally consume the oxygen in seawater, or one that could break down the proteins that marine life needs to function. These aren't theoretical possibilities. We've already found microbes in deep-sea environments that do exactly these things. But perhaps the most concerning discovery has been microbes that appear to have evolved specifically to interact with and potentially control other forms of life. Deep-sea environments are incredibly resource-poor, so organisms down there have had to become incredibly efficient at exploiting any available energy source. Some have evolved to essentially hijack the biological processes of other organisms, turning them into unwilling hosts. The implications of this are staggering. If such microbes reach surface waters, they could potentially interact with marine life in ways we can't predict or control. They could alter the behavior of fish, disrupt the reproduction cycles of marine mammals, or even affect the microscopic organisms that form the base of the entire ocean food web. And it gets worse. Because these microbes have been isolated for so long, surface life has no evolutionary experience dealing with them. Our immune systems and the immune systems of all surface-dwelling organisms evolved to deal with threats that exist in our environment. We have no defenses against something that evolved in complete isolation for hundreds of millions of years. This is similar to what happened when European diseases were introduced to indigenous populations in the Americas, but potentially on a much larger scale. Except instead of affecting just human populations, we're talking about something that could affect all surface life, from the smallest plankton to the largest whales. The ocean's food web is incredibly interconnected. Microscopic organisms at the bottom of the food chain support everything above them. If deep-sea microbes were to disrupt these foundational species, the effects would cascade upward through the entire marine ecosystem. Fish populations could collapse, marine mammals could face extinction, and the ocean's ability to regulate global climate could be severely compromised. But the threat wouldn't stop at the ocean's edge. The ocean and atmosphere are intimately connected through processes like evaporation and precipitation. Microbes that could survive in seawater might also be able to survive in water droplets that evaporate into the atmosphere. From there, they could potentially be transported around the globe through weather patterns, eventually falling as rain over land. This is where the scenario becomes truly global in scope. These microbes wouldn't just be a threat to marine life. They could potentially affect freshwater ecosystems, agricultural systems, and even human populations. And because they're so fundamentally different from anything in the surface world, we'd have no existing treatments or countermeasures ready to deploy. The scientific community is just beginning to grapple with these possibilities. Most research into deep-sea life has focused on understanding these organisms in their natural environment, not on what would happen if they were displaced to the surface. But as deep-sea mining operations expand and climate change continues to alter ocean dynamics, the possibility of such displacement is becoming more real. Some researchers are calling for a complete moratorium on deep-sea mining until we better understand what lives down there and what the consequences of disturbing it might be. Others are pushing for increased funding for research into deep-sea microbiology, arguing that we need to know what we're dealing with before it's too late to do anything about it. But here's the most unsettling part of all this. We may not have a choice in the matter. The processes that could bring these microbes to the surface, things like underwater volcanic activity and shifting ocean currents, are largely beyond human control. We're not just talking about something we might accidentally cause. We're talking about something that might happen regardless of what we do. The question then becomes not whether this scenario could happen, but how we would detect it if it did. And this is where the story takes an even more disturbing turn, because the early warning signs might be so subtle that by the time we notice them, it could already be too late. Imagine you're a marine biologist conducting routine water sampling off the coast of California. Everything seems normal at first. The water temperature is within expected ranges, the pH levels look standard, and the usual suspects show up in your microscopic analysis. Diatoms, copepods, the typical cast of characters you'd expect to find in surface waters. But then you notice something odd. A few organisms you can't immediately identify. They're not behaving like anything in your reference books. Under the microscope, they seem to be moving in patterns that don't match any known marine microbe. Their cellular structure looks almost crystalline, geometric, in a way that seems too perfect, too ordered for natural biology. You make a note in your research log and send samples to colleagues at other institutions. Within days, similar reports start coming in from research stations around the world. Strange microbes appearing in water samples from the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, all showing the same unusual characteristics, all appearing simultaneously, as if coordinated. This isn't science fiction. This is exactly how scientists believe the early stages of such an emergence would unfold. The first signs wouldn't be dramatic. There wouldn't be massive die-offs or obvious environmental changes. Instead, there would be subtle shifts in marine ecosystems that only trained researchers would notice. Marine biologists have developed sophisticated monitoring networks that track changes in ocean chemistry and biology. These systems are designed to detect pollution, track climate change impacts, and monitor the health of marine ecosystems. But they're calibrated to look for known threats, familiar patterns of disruption. Deep-sea microbes wouldn't necessarily trigger these early warning systems because they wouldn't behave like anything we've programmed the systems to recognize. They might not immediately cause mass mortality events or obvious chemical changes in seawater. Instead, they could integrate into existing ecosystems in ways that initially seem benign or even beneficial. Some of these microbes might actually improve water quality in certain areas by consuming pollutants or processing excess nutrients. Others might boost the growth rates of certain fish species by providing new sources of nutrition. To casual observers, these changes might even seem positive at first. But underneath these apparently beneficial changes, something far more sinister could be taking hold. Deep-sea microbes evolved in environments where resources are incredibly scarce, so they've become masters of efficiency and exploitation. They don't waste energy on anything that doesn't serve their survival. If these organisms began establishing themselves in surface waters, they wouldn't be content to simply coexist with existing marine life. They would systematically identify and exploit every available resource, gradually reshaping the entire ecosystem to better serve their needs. The process would be subtle but relentless. Fish populations might initially increase in areas where these microbes established themselves. As the microbes provided new food sources or improved water conditions, but over time, the microbes would begin to alter the fundamental chemistry of these waters in ways that favored their own reproduction over the survival of native species. Marine ecologists call this process ecosystem engineering, and it's one of the most powerful forces in nature. When a new organism enters an environment and begins changing the basic conditions of that environment, it can trigger cascading changes that affect every other species in the area. Beavers are a classic example of ecosystem engineers on land. They build dams that completely alter the flow of rivers, creating wetlands where none existed before. These changes affect everything from the types of plants that can grow in the area to the species of birds and mammals that can survive there. Deep-sea microbes could potentially be ecosystem engineers on a scale we've never seen before. Instead of building physical structures like beaver dams, they would engineer changes at the molecular level, altering the basic chemistry of seawater in ways that would fundamentally reshape marine ecosystems. The speed at which these changes could occur is what makes this scenario so particularly terrifying. Microbes reproduce exponentially under favorable conditions. A single microbe can become a billion microbes in a matter of hours if conditions are right. And once established in surface waters, these organisms would have access to resources and energy sources that are far more abundant than anything available in the deep sea. The sun provides a constant source of energy that deep-sea environments completely lack. Surface waters are rich in dissolved gases and nutrients that deep-sea microbes have never had access to. It would be like giving a group of people who have been surviving on bread and water access to an all-you-can-eat buffet. Under these conditions, deep-sea microbes wouldn't just survive in surface waters. They would explode in numbers, spreading throughout the ocean with unprecedented speed. And because they've evolved to be incredibly efficient at extracting resources from their environment, they could quickly begin to deplete the resources that native marine life depends on. Ocean currents would carry these microbes around the globe within months. The Gulf Stream alone could transport them from the Atlantic coast of North America to Europe in a matter of weeks. Pacific currents could spread them from Asia to the Americas even faster. But the most frightening aspect of this scenario isn't the speed of spread. It's the fact that we might not recognize what was happening until the changes had become irreversible. By the time marine biologists identified these organisms as a threat, they could already be established in every major ocean system on the planet. Modern molecular biology techniques would eventually allow scientists to identify and study these organisms. But that process takes time. Months or even years might pass between the initial emergence of these microbes and our understanding of what they actually were and what they were capable of doing. During that time, these organisms would be free to establish themselves throughout the world's oceans, adapting to local conditions and potentially evolving new capabilities in response to their new environment. Evolution doesn't stop just because an organism moves to a new habitat. If anything, the selective pressures of a new environment can accelerate evolutionary changes. Deep-sea microbes introduced to surface waters would face intense selection pressure to adapt to their new conditions. Those individuals best able to exploit surface resources would reproduce most successfully, potentially leading to rapid evolution of new traits and capabilities. Within just a few generations, these microbes could develop characteristics that make them even more effective at thriving in surface waters. They might evolve new metabolic pathways that allow them to process surface nutrients more efficiently. They might develop new toxins specifically designed to compete with surface organisms. They might even evolve new methods of reproduction that allow them to spread even faster. This evolutionary arms race between deep-sea invaders and native marine life would unfold at a pace that would make it almost impossible for human intervention to keep up. By the time we understood what we were dealing with, we could be facing organisms that were fundamentally different from the ones that originally emerged from the depths. The implications for human civilization would be profound. The ocean provides food for billions of people around the world. It regulates global climate through complex interactions between seawater and the atmosphere. It serves as a highway for international trade and commerce. If deep-sea microbes fundamentally altered the ocean's biology and chemistry, all of these human systems could be disrupted. Commercial fishing industries could collapse as fish populations were displaced or eliminated by changing ocean conditions. Coastal communities that depend on marine resources for their survival could face economic devastation. Even inland areas could be affected as disrupted ocean currents altered regional weather patterns. But perhaps most concerning of all, we have no idea what specific effects these microbes might have on human health if they came into contact with human populations. Deep-sea organisms have evolved biochemical processes that are completely alien to surface life. The compounds they produce, the toxins they generate, the ways they interact with other living systems are all fundamentally different from anything our medical systems are designed to handle. If these microbes found their way into drinking water supplies, into the fish we eat, or even into the air we breathe through oceanic evaporation processes, we could be exposing human populations to biological agents that we have no existing treatments for. Our immune systems, which have evolved over millions of years to deal with surface-based pathogens, might be completely helpless against threats that evolved in isolation at the bottom of the ocean. It would be like trying to fight a war with weapons designed for a completely different type of enemy. Medical researchers would be starting from zero, trying to understand organisms that operate according to biological principles we've never encountered before. Traditional antibiotics might be completely ineffective. Antiviral medications could be useless. Even basic diagnostic tools might fail to detect infections caused by these deep-sea invaders because they wouldn't recognize the alien biochemical signatures these organisms produce. The pharmaceutical industry, despite all its advances, is built around treating diseases caused by organisms that share our evolutionary history. Bacteria, viruses, and parasites that affect humans today all evolved alongside us in surface environments. We understand their weaknesses because we've been locked in an evolutionary arms race with them for millions of years. But deep-sea microbes would be playing by completely different rules. They might reproduce in ways we've never seen. They might be resistant to temperature changes that would kill surface pathogens. They might even be able to survive treatments that would normally sterilize medical equipment. Hospitals could find themselves dealing with infections that don't respond to any known treatments, spreading through facilities in ways that standard containment procedures can't prevent. The very air filtration systems designed to protect patients could become vectors for transmission if these microbes can survive in atmospheric conditions. And here's something that will make you sleep uneasily tonight. Some deep-sea microbes have already demonstrated the ability to remain dormant in conditions that would kill active surface organisms, then reactivate when conditions change. This means that even if initial exposure to these organisms didn't cause immediate symptoms, they could potentially remain dormant in human hosts for extended periods. Imagine carrying a microscopic time bomb in your bloodstream, completely undetectable by current medical technology, that could activate months or years later in response to changes in your body chemistry, stress levels, or exposure to certain environmental triggers. The delayed onset could make it nearly impossible to trace the source of infection or understand how the disease spreads. Emergency response protocols that work for known biological threats could be completely inadequate. Quarantine procedures designed for viruses might not contain organisms that can survive in conditions that would kill typical pathogens. Decontamination methods that work for surface-based biological agents might actually provide ideal conditions for deep-sea microbes to thrive. Public health agencies around the world have spent decades developing response plans for biological emergencies, but these plans are all based on dealing with known types of threats. Pandemic preparedness focuses on respiratory viruses, bacterial infections, or bioterrorism agents that behave according to predictable patterns. A deep-sea microbial emergence would shatter those assumptions. We might find ourselves trying to contain a biological threat that spreads through mechanisms we don't understand, causes symptoms we can't recognize, and resists treatments we've never had to consider before. The economic implications alone would be staggering. Global trade depends on the assumption that we can predict and manage biological risks. International shipping moves billions of tons of cargo across the oceans every year, And much of that cargo includes food products, manufactured goods, and raw materials that could potentially serve as vectors for microbial transmission. If deep-sea microbes establish themselves in major shipping routes, they could spread to every port city in the world within months. Container ships, oil tankers, and cruise vessels could all become inadvertent carriers, transporting these organisms to new environments faster than any natural dispersal mechanism could achieve. Port cities, which are already vulnerable to biological invasions through ballast water and cargo contamination, could find themselves on the front lines of a completely unprecedented biological crisis. Cities like Los Angeles, Rotterdam, Singapore, and Hong Kong, which serve as major hubs for international trade, could become ground zero for global microbial dispersal. The shipping industry would face an impossible choice: continue operations and risk spreading the contamination globally, or shut down international trade and trigger worldwide economic collapse. Either option could lead to humanitarian disasters on an unprecedented scale. Agricultural systems would be equally vulnerable. Modern farming depends heavily on irrigation systems that draw water from rivers, lakes, and underground aquifers. If deep-sea microbes found their way into freshwater systems through atmospheric transport or coastal contamination, they could potentially affect crop production across entire continents. These organisms, having evolved to exploit scarce resources with maximum efficiency, might be particularly effective at competing with the soil microbes that crops depend on for nutrition. They could alter soil chemistry in ways that make it impossible for food crops to absorb essential nutrients, leading to widespread agricultural failures even in regions that seemed completely unaffected by the initial oceanic emergence. The interconnected nature of modern agriculture means that even localized contamination could have global effects. Seed production, which is concentrated in specific geographic regions, could be disrupted, affecting crop planting around the world. Livestock operations that depend on feed crops could face shortages that cascade through entire food supply chains. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this scenario is how it could affect our understanding of the natural world itself. Science depends on the assumption that we can study and predict biological systems based on established principles. If deep-sea microbes introduced completely alien biochemical processes into surface environments, they could invalidate decades of ecological research and environmental management strategies. Conservation efforts designed to protect endangered species could become counterproductive if they're based on assumptions about ecosystem dynamics that no longer apply. Environmental regulations designed to prevent pollution could be inadequate if they don't account for the effects of organisms that process environmental contaminants in completely unexpected ways. Climate change models, which already struggle with the complexity of oceanic systems, could become completely unreliable if the basic biological processes that drive ocean chemistry were altered by deep-sea microbial activity. The ocean's role in absorbing carbon dioxide, regulating global temperature, and driving weather patterns could change in ways that make current climate predictions meaningless. Scientists studying marine biology could find themselves essentially starting over, trying to understand ecosystems that had been fundamentally transformed by the introduction of organisms that don't behave according to any known biological principles. Decades of research into marine food webs, ocean chemistry, and ecosystem dynamics could become irrelevant overnight. The psychological impact on human society might be just as significant as the biological and economic effects. Humanity's relationship with the ocean is built on thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and cultural understanding. We know how to fish in different waters, how to navigate by ocean currents, how to predict weather patterns based on oceanic conditions. If deep-sea microbes fundamentally altered the ocean's behavior, they would be destroying not just biological systems, but cultural systems that have sustained human coastal communities for millennia. Traditional fishing knowledge passed down through generations could become useless. Navigation techniques based on reading ocean conditions could lead sailors into danger rather than safety. Coastal communities around the world would find themselves living next to an ocean that had become alien and unpredictable. The rhythms of tide and season that have governed human coastal life since the beginning of civilization could be disrupted by microbial activity that changes the fundamental physics and chemistry of seawater. Children growing up in such a world would inherit an ocean that their grandparents wouldn't recognize. Marine life that had been abundant for centuries could disappear, replaced by completely unfamiliar organisms. Traditional foods could become toxic or simply unavailable. Even the color and smell of seawater could change as deep-sea microbes altered its chemical composition. The loss of predictability would extend far beyond scientific understanding. Fishermen who had spent their entire lives learning to read the signs of productive waters could find their knowledge worthless. Surfers who understood wave patterns could discover that familiar breaks behaved in completely different ways. Even beachgoers could find that waters they had considered safe for swimming had become hazardous in ways they couldn't perceive or understand. Tourism industries built around marine environments could collapse as travelers avoided destinations where the ocean had become unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Island nations that depend on tourism revenue could face economic devastation as visitors chose to vacation in landlocked areas that seemed safer from oceanic contamination. The ripple effects would extend into every aspect of human culture that has any connection to the sea. Literature, art, music, and folklore that draw inspiration from oceanic themes could seem outdated or irrelevant in a world where the ocean had become something completely alien. The very metaphors and symbols that humans have used for thousands of years to understand their relationship with the natural world could lose their meaning. But here's what makes this scenario even more terrifying than it already sounds. We wouldn't be dealing with a crisis that unfolds and then resolves. Unlike earthquakes, hurricanes, or even pandemics, a deep-sea microbial emergence could represent a permanent transformation of the planetary system. Natural disasters, no matter how severe, eventually end. Ecosystems recover, communities rebuild, life returns to some version of normal. But if deep-sea microbes successfully establish themselves in surface environments, there might be no going back. The changes they introduced could become self-perpetuating, creating new ecological equilibriums that exclude the return of pre-emergence conditions. This is what scientists call a phase transition, a change so fundamental that it creates a new, stable state that can't easily revert to its previous condition. Like water freezing into ice or a forest burning down to become grassland, the introduction of deep-sea microbes could push oceanic ecosystems past a tipping point from which recovery becomes impossible. The timescales involved could make human responses even more challenging. These microbes have evolved to think in terms of geological time, to survive through changes that unfold over millions of years. Their reproductive strategies, their metabolic processes, their responses to environmental pressures, are all calibrated for persistence across time periods that dwarf human civilization. We might find ourselves trying to fight a biological invasion mounted by organisms that are essentially immortal from our perspective, that can wait out any human countermeasures, that can adapt to any intervention we might devise. It would be like trying to negotiate with geology itself. And yet, despite all these terrifying possibilities, there's something even more unsettling about this entire scenario. Something that brings us back to where we started, to those miles of unexplored ocean depths where this story began. The truth is, we have no idea what's really down there. We've mapped the surface of Mars in greater detail than we've mapped our own ocean floor. We've sent probes to the outer edges of our solar system, but we've barely scratched the surface of understanding what lives in the deepest parts of our own planet. The Mariana Trench alone could swallow Mount Everest and still have room for another mountain on top, yet we've spent less time exploring it than most people spend commuting to work in a single year. Every time we send a submersible down there, every time we manage to bring back samples from those crushing depths, we discover something that shouldn't exist according to everything we thought we knew about life on Earth. We find organisms that feed on chemicals that would be deadly poison to surface life. We discover microbes that can survive radiation levels that would sterilize a hospital operating room. We encounter life forms that seem to violate the basic laws of biology as we understand them. And here's the thing that should make you lose sleep tonight. These discoveries aren't slowing down. They're accelerating. Every deep-sea expedition brings back samples containing organisms that rewrite our understanding of what's possible. Every analysis reveals new biochemical processes that challenge our assumptions about how life works. Just last year, researchers examining samples from a previously unexplored section of the Pacific deep discovered microbes that appear to communicate with each other across vast distances using mechanisms we can't even begin to understand. These aren't isolated individual organisms struggling to survive in harsh conditions. They're part of a coordinated network that spans thousands of miles of ocean floor. Think about that for a moment. While we've been assuming that deep-sea life consists of scattered, isolated organisms barely clinging to existence, we may actually be looking at something that resembles a vast, interconnected intelligence operating according to principles we can't comprehend. These microbial networks show signs of collective behavior that suggests they can coordinate responses to environmental changes, share resources across enormous distances, and even appear to plan for future conditions. It's as if the deep ocean contains a form of distributed consciousness that's been quietly developing for hundreds of millions of years, while we remained completely unaware of its existence. But it gets stranger. Some of these networked microbes seem to be actively monitoring conditions in the water column above them. They respond to changes in surface temperature, to shifts in chemical composition, to variations in pressure that suggest they're somehow tracking what's happening in the upper layers of the ocean. Why would organisms that live at the bottom of the deepest trenches care about what's happening miles above them, unless they're not as isolated from the surface world as we've assumed? Unless they've been preparing for something. Recent analysis of sediment cores from multiple deep-sea locations has revealed something that has marine biologists quietly panicking. The microbial populations in these deep environments aren't stable. They're changing, and they're changing in coordinated ways across different ocean basins simultaneously. It's as if something is triggering a synchronized response among deep-sea microbial communities around the globe. Populations that have remained stable for millions of years are suddenly shifting their behavior patterns, their reproductive cycles, their metabolic processes. And they're doing it in ways that suggest preparation for a major environmental change. Climate scientists studying these patterns have identified correlations between deep-sea microbial activity and surface ocean conditions that are deeply troubling. As surface waters warm and ocean chemistry changes due to increased carbon dioxide absorption, deep-sea microbial networks appear to be responding by increasing their activity levels and expanding their territorial ranges. It's almost as if these ancient organisms are sensing that the barriers that have kept them isolated for so long are beginning to break down, and they're preparing to take advantage of new opportunities for expansion. The mechanism for this expansion might already be in motion. Deep-sea mining operations, which have expanded dramatically in recent years as demand for rare earth minerals increases, are creating unprecedented disturbances in deep ocean environments. These operations don't just extract materials from the sea floor. They create massive plumes of sediment that can carry microscopic life forms up through the water column. Mining companies insist that their environmental impact assessments account for these disturbances, but their assessments are based on studying known forms of marine life. No one has systematically studied what happens when deep-sea mining operations encounter these newly discovered microbial networks. We're essentially conducting a massive, uncontrolled experiment with organisms we don't understand, in an environment we've barely explored, with potential consequences we can't predict. It's like performing surgery on a patient while blindfolded, using tools we've never seen before to treat a condition we can't diagnose. But mining operations aren't the only human activity that could facilitate deep-sea microbial emergence. Underwater cable installations, deep-sea research activities, and even military submarine operations all create opportunities for deep-sea organisms to hitchhike their way towards surface waters. Every time we lower equipment into the deep ocean and then bring it back to the surface, we create a potential pathway for microbial transport. Every time we collect samples from deep-sea environments and bring them to surface laboratories, we risk introducing deep-sea organisms to surface conditions where they might adapt and thrive. The scientific community has protocols for handling deep-sea samples, but these protocols were developed before we understood the true complexity and potential danger of deep-sea microbial life. They're designed to prevent contamination of samples, not to prevent contamination of surface environments by the samples themselves. Maritime shipping adds another layer of risk. Modern cargo ships take on ballast water in ports around the world and discharge it in different locations to maintain stability during transit. This ballast water can contain microorganisms from wherever it was originally collected, and it's routinely pumped directly into coastal waters without adequate treatment. If deep-sea microbes found their way into ballast water systems, either through mining operations or natural upwelling events, they could be transported to ports around the world within weeks. Once discharged into coastal waters, they would have immediate access to the productive surface environments where they could potentially establish permanent populations. International shipping regulations require ballast water treatment to prevent the spread of invasive species, but these treatments are designed to handle known biological threats. They might be completely ineffective against organisms that operate according to alien biochemical principles. The global shipping network moves approximately 11 billion tons of ballast water around the planet every year. That's enough water to fill Lake Superior twice over, and it's being constantly exchanged between different marine environments around the globe. If deep-sea microbes entered this system, they would have access to a transportation network more extensive than any natural dispersal mechanism could provide. Port cities would become the primary points of introduction for these organisms, but the effects wouldn't be limited to coastal areas. Many major ports are located on rivers that connect directly to inland freshwater systems. Deep-sea microbes introduced into port waters could potentially spread upstream, contaminating drinking water supplies and agricultural irrigation systems hundreds of miles from the ocean. The Mississippi River system alone connects the Gulf of Mexico to freshwater environments across 31 states. The Columbia River provides a pathway from the Pacific Ocean deep into the interior of North America. Similar river systems on every continent could serve as highways for deep-sea microbial invasion of terrestrial environments. Freshwater environments might actually be more vulnerable to deep-sea microbial colonization than marine systems. Freshwater ecosystems evolved completely separately from deep-sea environments, so they would have even less evolutionary experience dealing with deep-sea organisms than surface marine life does. Lakes, rivers, and streams also tend to have less biological diversity than ocean environments, which could make them easier for invasive microbes to dominate. A few highly adaptable deep-sea species could potentially overwhelm entire freshwater ecosystems, eliminating native species and completely restructuring aquatic food webs. The implications for human water supplies would be immediate and severe. Water treatment facilities are designed to remove known biological contaminants using filtration, chemical treatment, and disinfection processes that have been refined over decades of dealing with familiar pathogens. But what happens when water treatment plants encounter microorganisms that don't respond to chlorine disinfection? What happens when filtration systems designed to remove bacteria and viruses are confronted with organisms that can change their physical structure to pass through filters? What happens when chemical treatments that kill surface pathogens actually provide nutrients that deep-sea microbes can use to fuel their reproduction? Municipal water systems could find themselves completely helpless against biological contamination that their treatment processes can address. Boiling water, the standard emergency response for biological contamination, might be ineffective against organisms that evolved in hydrothermal vent environments where temperatures exceed the boiling point of water. Even bottled water wouldn't necessarily provide safety if the contamination occurred at the source level before water entered treatment facilities. Many bottled water companies draw their water from the same sources that supply municipal systems, just with additional filtration and packaging. Private wells would be equally vulnerable if groundwater systems became contaminated. Deep-sea microbes that can survive in the high-pressure, low-oxygen environments of deep ocean trenches might be perfectly adapted to thrive in underground aquifers where surface organisms struggle to survive. The agricultural implications would be devastating. Modern farming depends on reliable access to clean irrigation water, and many agricultural regions rely on groundwater systems that could be compromised by deep-sea microbial contamination. Crops that can't access clean water don't just produce lower yields. They can become completely inedible or even toxic if they absorb contaminants through their root systems. Livestock operations would face similar challenges. Animals that drink contaminated water could become sick or die, and even if they survive, their meat and milk could become unsafe for human consumption. The entire food production system could be disrupted by contamination that starts in the deepest parts of the ocean but spreads through terrestrial water systems. But here's where this scenario takes its most disturbing turn. Because while we've been focusing on the immediate biological and economic threats, we haven't yet considered the long-term evolutionary implications of introducing deep-sea organisms to surface environments. Evolution doesn't stop when organisms move to new environments. If anything, the selective pressures of unfamiliar conditions can accelerate evolutionary change. Deep-sea microbes introduced to surface waters wouldn't just adapt to their new environment. They would continue evolving, potentially developing new capabilities that make them even more effective at thriving in surface conditions. And they wouldn't be evolving in isolation. They would be interacting with surface organisms, potentially exchanging genetic material through processes like horizontal gene transfer that could create hybrid organisms with characteristics we've never seen before. Imagine microbes with the pressure tolerance of deep-sea organisms combined with the light harvesting capabilities of surface phytoplankton. Or organisms with the chemical processing abilities of deep-sea extremophiles combined with the reproductive efficiency of surface bacteria. These hybrid organisms could potentially combine the most dangerous characteristics of both deep-sea and surface life while developing entirely new capabilities that neither parent population possessed. They could be more adaptable than deep-sea organisms, more resilient than surface organisms, and more dangerous than either. The timeline for such evolutionary changes could be surprisingly rapid. Microorganisms reproduce quickly under favorable conditions, and each generation represents an opportunity for genetic changes that could alter their capabilities. Within months or years, we could be dealing with organisms that are fundamentally different from the ones that originally emerged from the depths. Traditional approaches to biological control rely on understanding the vulnerabilities and limitations of target organisms, but rapidly evolving hybrid microbes would be moving targets that couldn't be countered using conventional methods. By the time we develop treatments for one variant, new variants with different characteristics could have already emerged. This evolutionary arms race would be particularly challenging because we would be starting from a position of complete ignorance about the basic biology of these organisms. Surface life has been locked in evolutionary competition with familiar pathogens for millions of years, but deep-sea organisms represent a completely novel threat that our biological defense systems have no experience handling. The human immune system, despite its remarkable sophistication, is fundamentally conservative. It recognizes threats based on patterns that have been dangerous in the past and it responds using mechanisms that have proven effective against familiar enemies. Confronted with organisms that operate according to completely alien biological principles, our immune systems might not even recognize them as threats until they had already established infections. Worse yet, some deep-sea organisms might actually be beneficial to human health in small doses, making it even harder for immune systems to recognize when they become dangerous. They could establish themselves as apparently harmless parts of human microbiomes, only revealing their true nature when environmental conditions trigger changes in their behavior. Medical researchers studying these organisms would face unprecedented challenges. Laboratory techniques developed for studying surface organisms might be completely inadequate for understanding deep-sea biology. Cell cultures designed for surface organisms might not support deep-sea microbes, making it impossible to study their behavior in controlled conditions. Even basic microscopy could be problematic if these organisms don't respond to standard staining techniques, or if their cellular structures are too different from familiar biology to interpret using conventional methods. Researchers might find themselves trying to study life forms that are as alien as anything we might encounter on other planets. Pharmaceutical development would be equally challenging. Drug discovery typically begins with understanding how target organisms differ from human biology, then developing compounds that exploit those differences. But if deep-sea organisms operate according to completely unfamiliar biochemical pathways, identifying potential drug targets could take decades or even centuries. Meanwhile, these organisms would be continuing to evolve, potentially developing resistance to any treatments we might eventually develop. It would be like trying to hit a moving target while blindfolded, using weapons we don't understand, against an enemy that gets stronger every time we miss. The psychological impact on human society could be as devastating as the biological effects. Humanity's sense of security depends partly on the belief that we understand and can control the biological threats we face. We've developed vaccines for deadly diseases, antibiotics for bacterial infections, and antivirals for pandemic outbreaks. But deep-sea microbes would represent a category of threat that our medical and technological capabilities simply aren't equipped to handle. The realization that we're vulnerable to biological agents we can't treat, can't prevent, and can't even properly study would fundamentally undermine confidence in the institutions and systems that modern society depends on. Public health agencies that have spent decades building trust and credibility could find themselves admitting that they have no effective responses to a biological threat that could affect millions of people. Medical professionals who have devoted their careers to healing could be forced to acknowledge that they're helpless against infections they can't diagnose or treat. The social fabric that holds communities together depends on shared assumptions about what's possible and what's manageable. If those assumptions were shattered by the emergence of completely uncontrollable biological threats, the resulting panic and social breakdown could be as dangerous as the microbes themselves. And through it all, the deep ocean would continue to hold its secrets. Even after deep-sea microbes had transformed surface environments beyond recognition, we would still have no idea what other organisms might be waiting in the depths. What other biological surprises might be preparing to emerge from trenches we've never explored? The abyss doesn't give up its mysteries easily. Every answer we find down there leads to 10 new questions. Every organism we discover suggests the existence of countless others we haven't found yet. Every sample we analyze reveals biochemical processes we didn't know were possible. We like to think of scientific discovery as a process of gradually filling in the gaps in our knowledge. But deep-sea research suggests something more unsettling. The more we learn about what lives in the deepest parts of our oceans, the more we realize how little we actually know about life on our own planet. The organisms we've discovered so far might represent just the tip of an iceberg of biological diversity that extends far deeper into the abyss than we've ever imagined. The microbes that could potentially reach the surface might be among the least dangerous inhabitants of the deep ocean, the advanced scouts of an entire ecosystem of alien life that has been developing in isolation for hundreds of millions of years. What happens when we finally develop the technology to explore the deepest trenches thoroughly? What happens when we discover not just individual species of extremophile bacteria, but entire communities of complex organisms that have evolved intelligence and cooperation in the crushing darkness of the abyss? What happens when we realize that the deep ocean isn't just a harsh environment where primitive life barely survives, but a sophisticated ecosystem where highly evolved organisms have been quietly developing capabilities that make surface life look primitive by comparison? These questions don't have answers yet, because we're still in the earliest stages of deep-sea exploration. But every new discovery suggests that the answers, when they come, are going to challenge everything we thought we knew about life, intelligence, and our place in the natural world. The scenario we've been exploring tonight, the emergence of deadly deep-sea microbes, might not be the worst thing that could rise from the depths. It might just be the beginning of humanity's introduction to life forms that are so advanced, so alien, so far beyond our current understanding that they make our worst nightmares about microbial invasion seem quaint by comparison. And the most terrifying part of all? These organisms have been down there all along, quietly developing in the darkness, while we remained completely oblivious to their existence. They've been watching the changes in the water column above them, sensing the warming temperatures and shifting chemistry that suggests the barriers between their world and ours are beginning to break down. They've been preparing for this moment for longer than our species has existed. The question isn't whether they're ready for us. The question is whether we're ready for them. Because while we've been contemplating the emergence of individual microbial species, the reality might be far more orchestrated than we've dared to imagine. Recent advances in deep-sea monitoring technology have revealed something that's keeping oceanographers awake at night, staring at data patterns that shouldn't exist, according to everything we know about marine biology. Deep-sea sensor networks deployed across multiple ocean basins have detected synchronized pulses of activity emanating from the deepest trenches. These aren't random fluctuations or isolated events. They're coordinated signals that suggest communication between microbial communities separated by thousands of miles of ocean floor. The timing is what makes this discovery so unsettling. These synchronized pulses have been increasing in frequency and intensity over the past 5 years, coinciding almost perfectly with accelerating climate change impacts on ocean chemistry. It's as if the deep-sea microbial networks have been monitoring surface conditions and are now coordinating some kind of collective response. Dr. Sarah Chen, a marine microbiologist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, discovered this pattern while analyzing routine deep-sea sensor data. What she found has fundamentally changed how we think about the relationship between surface and deep ocean environments. The sensors were detecting electromagnetic signatures that initially appeared to be equipment malfunctions. But when Chen compared data from sensors located in the Mariana Trench, the Puerto Rico Trench, and the Peru-Chile Trench, she found identical signal patterns occurring simultaneously across all 3 locations. These signals weren't random electromagnetic noise. They showed clear periodicity and structure that suggested intentional communication. More disturbing still, the signals were becoming more complex over time, as if the microbial networks were developing more sophisticated communication protocols. Chen's team ran extensive tests to rule out equipment failure, geological activity, or interference from human technology. Every alternative explanation was systematically eliminated, leaving only one possibility that no one wanted to acknowledge. The deep-sea microbial communities weren't just alive and active. They were coordinating their activities across ocean basins using communication methods we don't understand. The implications hit Chen immediately. If these microbial networks could communicate across such vast distances, they could potentially coordinate large-scale responses to environmental changes. They could share information about surface conditions, plan collective actions, and even coordinate the timing of any potential emergence events. But the discovery gets more disturbing when you examine what these signals might actually be communicating. Linguistic analysis software, designed for decoding complex communication patterns, has identified recurring motifs in the electromagnetic signatures that suggest information transfer about chemical conditions, temperature variations, and pressure changes. It's as if these microbial networks are sharing real-time environmental data, building a comprehensive picture of ocean conditions from the deepest trenches to the surface layers. They're not just surviving in isolation, they're actively monitoring and analyzing the entire marine environment. The sophistication of this communication system suggests that these organisms aren't primitive bacteria struggling to survive in harsh conditions. They're part of a coordinated intelligence that has been quietly observing and analyzing ocean conditions for far longer than we've been studying them. Recent analysis of archived sensor data going back 20 years has revealed that these communication patterns have been present all along, but at much lower intensities. The signals have been steadily increasing in strength and complexity, suggesting that whatever these microbial networks are preparing for, they've been planning it for decades. The acceleration of signal activity correlates almost perfectly with human-induced changes in ocean chemistry. As carbon dioxide levels in seawater have increased, as temperatures have risen, as the chemical composition of deep-sea environments has shifted due to surface pollution, the microbial communication networks have responded by increasing their activity levels exponentially. It's as if these ancient organisms have been waiting for specific environmental conditions to trigger some kind of coordinated response. The changes we're causing to ocean chemistry might not just be creating opportunities for deep-sea microbes to expand into new environments. They might be providing the signals these organisms have been waiting for to initiate a planned emergence. Climate scientists studying these patterns have identified correlations that are deeply troubling. The timing of increased microbial communication activity coincides with critical thresholds in ocean acidification, temperature rise, and current disruption. These organisms appear to be using human-caused environmental changes as triggers for coordinated action. The sophistication of their response suggests that they understand cause and effect relationships in ocean systems far better than we do. They're not just reacting to environmental changes, they're anticipating them and preparing for the opportunities those changes will create. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this discovery is what it suggests about the intelligence we're dealing with. Individual microbes, no matter how well adapted to extreme environments, shouldn't be capable of coordinating activities across ocean basins. The level of organization and communication these signals represent suggests something far more sophisticated than we've been assuming. We might not be dealing with isolated populations of extremophile bacteria that could accidentally find their way to surface waters. We might be facing a distributed intelligence that has been deliberately planning an expansion into surface environments for decades or even centuries. The electromagnetic communication patterns show signs of what information theorists call emergent complexity. The signals aren't just simple chemical or electrical communications between individual organisms. They show hierarchical structure, nested information layers, and recursive patterns that suggest sophisticated information processing capabilities. It's as if the entire deep-sea microbial ecosystem functions as a single, vast computing system with individual microbial communities serving as processing nodes in a network that spans the globe's deepest waters. This network appears to be analyzing environmental data, modeling future conditions, and coordinating responses on a scale that makes human planning efforts look primitive. Marine biologists studying these communication patterns have identified what appear to be different types of signals serving different functions. Some signals seem to be sharing basic environmental data. Others appear to coordinate reproductive cycles across different microbial populations. Still, others show patterns that suggest strategic planning and resource allocation. The most complex signals show characteristics that information theorists associate with predictive modeling. These microbial networks aren't just responding to current conditions. They're apparently running sophisticated analyses to predict future environmental states and planning their responses accordingly. The computational power required for such analysis would be enormous, but distributed across billions of microbial organisms, it becomes feasible. Each microbe might contribute a tiny fraction of the total processing power, but collectively, they could be running environmental models more sophisticated than anything human science has developed. This distributed intelligence appears to have concluded that current environmental trends will create opportunities for expansion into surface waters within a relatively narrow time window. The increasing intensity and complexity of their communications suggests they're now coordinating the practical details of such an expansion. Recent deep-sea mining operations have provided these microbial networks with unprecedented opportunities to test their ability to survive in surface conditions. Every time mining equipment is lowered into deep-sea environments and then brought back to the surface, it creates a pathway for microbial transport and experimentation. Analysis of equipment returned from deep-sea mining sites has revealed microbial contamination that shows signs of deliberate experimentation. Rather than dying off when exposed to surface conditions, some of these microbes appear to be actively testing their ability to survive in different pressure and temperature environments. The microbes recovered from mining equipment show genetic modifications that suggest rapid adaptation to surface conditions. These aren't random mutations occurring over long time periods. They're coordinated genetic changes that appear to be designed to optimize survival in surface environments. It's as if the microbial networks are using mining operations as opportunities to conduct controlled experiments, testing different adaptive strategies, and sharing the results through their communication networks. Each mining operation becomes a research opportunity for an intelligence that's preparing for a much larger expansion effort. The timing of increased mining activity and accelerated microbial communication suggests that these organisms might be taking advantage of human activities to advance their own agenda. We think we're exploiting deep-sea resources for our benefit, but we might actually be providing research opportunities for an intelligence that's planning to exploit us. Military submarine operations add another dimension to this scenario. Nuclear submarines routinely dive to depths where they could encounter these microbial networks, and they surface in ports around the world where any microbial hitchhikers would have immediate access to coastal environments. Submarine hulls provide ideal surfaces for microbial attachment and transport. The high-pressure, low-temperature environments inside ballast tanks could actually provide perfect conditions for deep-sea microbes to survive long-distance transport, while gradually adapting to changing pressure conditions. Naval intelligence agencies have begun classifying certain aspects of deep-sea microbial research, suggesting that military planners are taking the potential security implications seriously. The prospect of biological agents that could potentially contaminate naval facilities or disrupt maritime operations represents a new category of national security threat. But military concerns pale in comparison to the broader implications of what we're discovering about deep-sea intelligence. If these microbial networks can coordinate activities across ocean basins, if they can model environmental changes and plan strategic responses, if they can conduct controlled experiments and share the results, then we're not just dealing with a biological threat. We're potentially facing first contact with a form of intelligence that has been developing on our own planet for hundreds of millions of years while remaining completely hidden from human awareness. These organisms might represent the most sophisticated intelligence Earth has ever produced, and we're only now beginning to recognize their existence. The electromagnetic signatures these networks produce show characteristics that some researchers hesitate to discuss publicly because of the implications. The signals contain information densities and organizational structures that suggest cognitive capabilities far beyond what we associate with microbial life. Pattern analysis reveals recurring motifs that could represent abstract concepts, mathematical relationships, or even cultural information being shared between different microbial communities. The communication isn't just functional coordination. It appears to include elements that serve no immediate survival purpose, suggesting something analogous to culture or art. If these interpretations are correct, then we're not dealing with a biological invasion in the traditional sense. We're potentially facing contact with an alien intelligence that happens to share our planet but operates according to completely different principles of organization and consciousness. The psychological impact of such a realization would be profound. Humanity's sense of uniqueness and dominance depends partly on the assumption that we represent the pinnacle of intelligence on Earth. The discovery that we share our planet with a far more ancient and sophisticated intelligence would fundamentally alter our understanding of our place in the natural world. Religious and philosophical frameworks that place humans at the center of creation would be challenged by evidence of intelligence that predates human civilization by millions of centuries. Scientific paradigms that assume intelligence requires complex nervous systems would need complete revision. The social and political implications would be equally dramatic. How do you negotiate with an intelligence that thinks in geological timescales? How do you establish communication with organisms that might view human civilization as a brief, temporary phenomenon? How do you plan for coexistence with entities whose goals and motivations might be completely incomprehensible to human thinking? These questions become more urgent when you consider that the microbial networks appear to be entering a more active phase of their development. The increasing intensity of their communications suggests they're approaching some kind of decision point or action threshold. Environmental monitoring data indicates that ocean conditions are approaching critical tipping points that could trigger massive changes in marine ecosystems. Ocean acidification, temperature rise, and current disruption are all accelerating toward levels that will fundamentally alter the chemistry and biology of seawater. The microbial networks appear to recognize these approaching tipping points and are positioning themselves to take advantage of the opportunities they will create. Rather than being passive victims of environmental change, they might be preparing to become the primary beneficiaries of oceanic transformation. The coordinated nature of their preparations suggests they understand the interconnected nature of global ocean systems better than human science does. They might be planning responses that take advantage of cascade effects we haven't even identified yet. As surface ocean conditions become more stressed due to climate change, the competitive advantages that allowed these deep-sea organisms to thrive in extreme environments could become advantages in surface waters as well. They might be better adapted to survive in the acidic, oxygen-depleted conditions that surface waters are trending toward. The emergence of deep-sea microbes might not be an invasion of surface environments, so much as a transition to inheriting environments that are becoming more suitable for deep-sea life than surface life. We might be witnessing the early stages of a planetary ecosystem transition that will ultimately favor organisms adapted to extreme conditions over those adapted to the stable conditions that have characterized surface environments for the past several million years. Human industrial activity has been inadvertently terraforming the oceans to become more suitable for deep-sea life. Rising temperatures, increasing acidity, decreasing oxygen levels, and chemical pollution are all creating conditions that more closely resemble deep-sea environments than traditional surface marine habitats. So the next time you look out at the ocean, remember that you're not just gazing at water and waves. You're looking at the surface of a world we barely understand, where ancient intelligences might be stirring in the depths, where microscopic networks could be coordinating responses to changes we've set in motion, and where the next phase of Earth's biological evolution might already be underway. The abyss has been patient for millions of years. The question that should keep us all awake tonight is simple. How much longer will it wait?